On a cold November morning, Sarah Mitchell walked into a small diner with her 7-year-old daughter, Emma. They had just enough money for one breakfast to share. At the counter sat an elderly man in worn clothes, counting coins for a cup of coffee he couldn't afford. Sarah made a choice that morning, a choice that seemed small, even foolish given her own struggles. She bought him coffee. She had no idea that this man was testing people, searching for something he'd lost faith in. And she had no idea that her simple act of kindness was about to change both their lives forever. This is the story of how one cup of coffee revealed the true measure of a human heart. Sarah Mitchell sat at her small kitchen table, the early morning light barely pushing through the thin curtains of her modest apartment. Before her lay a stack of bills: electricity, rent, medical expenses, each one a reminder of how hard she was fighting just to stay afloat. Her fingers trembled slightly as she calculated the numbers again, hoping somehow they would add up differently this time. They never did. Across from her, 7-year-old Emma sat quietly, her small hands gripping a pencil as she worked on her homework. The little girl had learned not to ask for much. She had learned to be quiet when her mother's face looked like it did, now tight with worry, eyes distant with calculation and fear. "Mama, are you okay?" Emma's soft voice broke through Sarah's thoughts. Sarah looked up and forced a smile, the kind of smile that mothers perfect when they need to shield their children from the weight of the world. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about our day." It had been 3 years since Sarah's husband Michael had died in a construction accident. 3 years of learning to be both mother and father, provider and protector. 3 years of making impossible choices and stretching every dollar until it screamed. The life insurance had run out faster than she'd imagined. Her job as a checkout clerk at the local grocery store barely covered rent and food, let alone the growing pile of medical bills from Emma's asthma treatments. Sarah had sold almost everything of value. Michael's tools, her wedding ring, the small pieces of jewelry her mother had left her. The apartment was sparse now, functional but empty of the little luxuries that make a house feel like a home. Yet she kept it clean, kept it warm, kept it filled with as much love as she could muster on the days when exhaustion threatened to pull her under. "Can we have breakfast together today?" Emma asked, her eyes hopeful. "At the diner? Like we used to with Daddy?" Sarah's heart clenched. They used to go to Murphy's Diner every Saturday morning when Michael was alive. It had been their tradition, their special family time. Now, it was a luxury Sarah couldn't afford. But looking at Emma's face, seeing that spark of hope, Sarah made a calculation that had nothing to do with money. "Yes," Sarah said, reaching across to touch her daughter's hand. "We can do that." Emma's face lit up in a way that made every sacrifice worth it. Sarah knew they had exactly $23 to last until her next paycheck in 3 days. Breakfast would cost about $12 if they shared a meal. It was reckless. It was impractical. But sometimes Sarah had learned a child's joy was worth more than financial wisdom. 2 hours later, they walked hand in hand down the cold November street toward Murphy's Diner. Emma wore her best dress, a hand-me-down from a church donation that Sarah had carefully mended and washed until it looked almost new. Sarah wore her only good pair of jeans and a sweater that hid how thin she'd become from skipping meals to make sure Emma always had enough. The diner was warm and smelled of coffee and bacon, scents that belonged to a world Sarah used to inhabit more freely. They slid into a booth near the window, and Emma pressed her nose to the glass, watching the people pass by on the street. "What would you like, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, though she already knew they would share whatever was cheapest on the menu. "Pancakes," Emma whispered, as if saying it too loudly might make it disappear. "The ones with the blueberries." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "We'll share the pancake special." As she waited for the waitress, Sarah noticed an elderly man at the counter. He was thin, wearing clothes that had seen better days, a jacket with frayed cuffs, pants that were clean but worn. His weathered hands were counting coins on the counter, sliding them into small piles, counting them again. His face was lined with age and something else, a deep weariness that Sarah recognized because she saw it in her own mirror. The waitress, a young woman named Kelly, stood before him with her arms crossed. "Sir, that's only $2.35. Coffee is $3.50. "I thought it was $2, the old man said quietly, his voice dignified despite his embarrassment. "That was last year," Kelly said, not unkindly, but not particularly warmly either. Prices went up. The old man nodded slowly, gathering his coins. I understand, thank you anyway. Sarah watched as he stood to leave, his movements slow and careful, as if his bones hurt. Something in her chest twisted. She knew what it felt like to count coins and come up short. She knew the particular shame of wanting something as simple as a cup of coffee and not being able to afford it. Before she could think about it, before wisdom or practicality could stop her, Sarah stood up. "Excuse me," she called out. "Sir?" The old man turned, his eyes meeting hers, clear blue eyes that seemed to see more than they should. Sarah walked to the counter, her heart pounding. "I'd like to buy this gentleman a coffee, and whatever he'd like for breakfast." The diner seemed to go quiet, though that might have been Sarah's imagination. The elderly man stared at her, something flickering across his weathered face, surprise, confusion, and something deeper she couldn't quite name. "Miss, you don't need to do that," he said softly. "I know," Sarah replied, meaning it. "But I'd like to, please." Kelly, the waitress, looked between them, then shrugged and picked up her order pad. "What would it be, sir?" The old man hesitated, then spoke with quiet dignity. "Just coffee and toast would be fine. Thank you." "Get him the breakfast special," Sarah said to Kelly, even as the practical part of her mind screamed at what she was doing. That was another $8. Money she didn't have. Money Emma needed. "Ma'am, really," the old man began. "Please," Sarah said, and she meant that too. "Let me do this." There was a long moment where the old man studied her face, and Sarah had the strangest feeling that she was being measured somehow, weighed on scales she couldn't see. Then he nodded slowly. "You are very kind," he said. "What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Mitchell." "I'm Henry," he said, extending a hand that was rough with age and work. "Henry Thornton." They shook hands, and Sarah returned to her booth where Emma was watching with wide eyes. "Mama, we don't have enough money," Emma whispered, old beyond her years with worry. "I know, baby," Sarah said, pulling her daughter close. "But sometimes we have to help when we can. That man needed breakfast." "But we need breakfast too," Emma said, and there was no accusation in it, just confusion. "We'll be fine," Sarah promised, though she was already calculating. They would share their pancakes. She would give Emma most of it. She would make do with coffee. They would make it to Friday. Henry sat at the counter, and Sarah noticed him watching them in the reflection of the mirror behind the coffee pots. When his breakfast came, he ate slowly, savoring each bite in a way that told Sarah he hadn't eaten well in some time. It made her choice feel right, even if it was foolish. When their pancakes arrived, Emma's eyes went wide with delight. Sarah cut the stack in half, giving Emma the larger portion, and they ate slowly, making it last. The blueberries were sweet, the syrup rich, and for a few moments, Sarah let herself enjoy this small luxury, this memory she was creating for her daughter. She didn't notice that Henry had finished his meal and was speaking quietly with Kelly at the register. She didn't see the way he looked at her and Emma, or the way his eyes softened with something that might have been recognition or remembrance or regret. When Sarah went to pay, Kelly handed her the check with a strange expression. Sarah looked down at the slip of paper and froze. Written across it in shaky but firm handwriting were the words, "Paid in full. Thank you for your kindness. H.T." "The old man paid for your breakfast before he left," Kelly explained, "and he left you this." She handed Sarah a $20 bill. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She looked toward the door, but Henry was already gone, disappeared into the cold November morning like he'd never been there at all. "Mama, why are you crying?" Emma asked, tugging at her sleeve. "Because people can be good, sweetheart," Sarah whispered. "People can be so good." They walked home in the cold, but Sarah felt warm. $20 wasn't much in the grand scheme of her problems, but it meant Emma could have lunch money for the week. It meant they could buy milk and bread. It meant Sarah's small act of kindness had been returned threefold, and that in itself felt like a kind of grace. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah sat at her kitchen table and cried. She cried from exhaustion, from stress, from the constant weight of being alone in this fight, but she also cried from something else. From the reminder that kindness still existed in the world, that small acts still mattered, that she wasn't as alone as she sometimes felt. She had no idea that Henry Thornton had returned to a mansion on the other side of the city. She had no idea that he'd sat in his study, a room filled with expensive art and leather-bound books, and thought about her face, her sacrifice, her daughter's eyes. She had no idea that Henry Thornton was one of the wealthiest men in the state, a billionaire who had spent the last 6 months dressing in old clothes and visiting diners and shops and parks, looking for something he'd lost faith in, genuine human kindness. And she had no idea that she had just passed a test she didn't know she was taking. 3 days later, Sarah was running late for her shift at the grocery store. Emma's asthma had flared up during the night, and Sarah had spent hours sitting with her, holding the nebulizer, stroking her hair, praying the breathing would ease. By morning, Emma was better, but Sarah was exhausted, moving through the apartment like someone walking through deep water. She was locking her apartment door when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Looking up, she froze. Standing before her was Henry Thornton, but not the Henry she had met at the diner. This Henry wore an expensive suit, tailored perfectly to his thin frame. His shoes were polished leather. His silver hair was neatly combed. He carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being listened to, respected, obeyed. "Mr. Mayan." "Thornton?" Sarah stammered, confused. "Hello, Sarah," he said with a gentle smile. "I apologize for appearing at your home unannounced. Might we talk for a few minutes?" Sarah glanced at her watch. She was already going to be late. "I have to get to work. I can't. I've already called your manager," Henry said calmly. "I explained that you were needed for an urgent family matter. You won't lose your job, and you'll be paid for the full shift." Sarah's mind reeled. "How did you... Who are you? May we sit?" Henry gestured to the small bench at the top of the stairs. In a daze, Sarah sat. Emma peeked out from the apartment doorway, curious. "Hi there," Henry said to her warmly. "You must be Emma. Your mother told me about you." Emma smiled shyly and waved. Henry turned back to Sarah, his blue eyes serious now. "Sarah, I haven't been entirely honest with you. My name is Henry Thornton. That much is true, but I'm not a homeless man who can't afford coffee." He pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a news article. The headline read, "Billionaire Henry Thornton steps down as CEO of Thornton Industries after 50 years. Sarah's mouth fell open. The photo showed the same man sitting beside her, though in the picture he was younger, standing in front of a massive building with his name on it. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered. Henry sighed, and for a moment, he looked every one of his 76 years. 6 months ago, my wife of 52 years passed away. Margaret was the love of my life, my compass, my conscience. After she died, I found myself wondering about the world I'd helped create. I'd spent my life building a business empire, making money, wielding power, but I realized I didn't know anymore if people were good or if they were just good to me because of what I could give them." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "So I started an experiment. I dressed in old clothes and visited places where no one would know my name. I wanted to see how people treated someone who had nothing. For 6 months, I'd been testing people, watching how they respond to someone in need." Sarah felt something cold settling in her stomach. "You were testing me?" "Yes," Henry said simply. "And you're the first person in 6 months who helped without hesitation, even though you clearly couldn't afford it. Do you know how I knew that?" Sarah shook her head, numb. "Your daughter's coat has been mended 4 times. Your shoes have cardboard in them to cover the holes. You ordered 1 meal for 2 people. And yet, when you saw someone in need, you didn't hesitate. You gave." Tears started rolling down Sarah's cheeks. "I don't want to be someone's experiment." "I know," Henry said gently, "and I apologize for the deception. But Sarah, what you did meant something. It told me that kindness still exists, that sacrifice still matters, that my wife was right to believe in the goodness of ordinary people." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. "I'd like to repay your kindness if you'll let me." "I don't want money," Sarah said quickly, though the words hurt to say. "I didn't help you for a reward." "I know," Henry said. "That's exactly why I want to help you. Sarah, will you at least look at what I'm offering?" With shaking hands, Sarah opened the folder. Inside were documents, contracts, agreements, letters. Her eyes caught phrases: full-time position, Thornton Foundation, Director of Community Outreach, annual salary. She saw the number and gasped. It was more than she made in 3 years at the grocery store. "I'm starting a charitable foundation in my wife's name," Henry explained. "Its mission will be to help single parents, working families, people who fall through the cracks. I need someone to run it who understands what it means to struggle, to sacrifice, to choose kindness even when it costs. I need someone with your heart." "I'm not qualified," Sarah protested. "I didn't even finish college. I'm just a checkout clerk." "You're qualified in the ways that matter," Henry said firmly. "You're honest, you're compassionate, you understand the people we'd be helping because you've lived their life. Everything else can be taught." Sarah looked at Emma, who was watching with wide, hopeful eyes. She looked at the papers in her hands. She looked at this strange, wealthy man who had tested her heart and found it worthy. "Why?" she whispered. "Why me?" Henry's eyes grew distant. "When my wife was dying, she made me promise something. She said, 'Henry, you've spent your life building an empire. Promise me you'll spend what's left building a legacy of kindness.' This is how I keep that promise. Through people like you." Sarah didn't sleep for 3 days. The contract sat on her kitchen table like a living thing, full of possibility and terror in equal measure. $75,000 a year, health insurance that would cover Emma's asthma medications, a position that could change their lives forever. It felt too good to be true, and Sarah had learned the hard way that things that seemed too good to be true usually were. She called the number Henry had given her and spoke to his lawyer, a crisp professional woman named Ms. Chen, who confirmed every detail. Yes, the offer was real. Yes, Mr. Thornton was serious. Yes, they wanted Sarah to start in 2 weeks. "But I don't understand why he chose me," Sarah said into the phone, her voice small. "Mr. Thornton rarely explains his decisions," Ms. Chen replied. "But he's a brilliant judge of character. If he chose you, there's a reason." That night, Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Emma's soft breathing from the next room. She thought about Michael, about what he would say if he were here. He'd always been the brave one, the one who took chances, who believed things would work out. Sarah was the cautious one, the planner, the one who expected the worst so she wouldn't be disappointed. But cautiousness had gotten her a life of barely surviving. Maybe it was time to be brave. The next morning, Sarah told her manager at the grocery store that she'd be leaving in 2 weeks. Tom, a kind man who'd always been fair to her, looked genuinely happy. "You deserve this, Sarah," he said. "You've worked harder than anyone I know. Go build something better." The 2 weeks passed in a blur. Sarah met with Ms. Chen, signed papers, underwent background checks, and attended orientation sessions at the Thornton Foundation offices, a beautiful building downtown that made Sarah feel like she'd stepped into another world. She met the staff who would work under her, social workers, grant administrators, accountants, and volunteers. They all looked at her with curiosity, wondering who this woman was that Henry Thornton had personally selected. Sarah wondered the same thing. On her first official day, Henry himself gave her a tour of the facility. He showed her the conference rooms where they'd review grant applications, the offices where caseworkers would meet with families in need, the storage rooms filled with supplies they'd distribute to those who needed them. "This is overwhelming," Sarah admitted as they stood in what would be her office, a beautiful room with windows overlooking the city. "It should be," Henry said. "You're about to help change lives, Sarah. That's not small work." "What if I fail?" The question burst out before she could stop it. "What if I'm not good enough, or smart enough, or—" "Sarah," Henry interrupted gently. "Do you know why I really chose you?" She shook her head. "Because you understand something most people with money and power forget. What it means to be desperate. To have to choose between medicine and food. To love someone so much you'd give up everything for them. The people we're going to help don't need someone who's always been successful. They need someone who knows what it's like to barely survive and still chooses kindness." He placed a hand on her shoulder, fatherly and warm. "You bought a stranger coffee when you couldn't afford to feed yourself properly. That told me everything I needed to know about your character." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I'm scared." "Good," Henry said. "Fear means you understand the responsibility. Now let me tell you something my wife once told me. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to act despite it." Over the next 3 months, Sarah threw herself into the work. She reviewed applications from single mothers trying to keep their children housed. She met with elderly people choosing between medication and food. She spoke with workers who'd been injured and couldn't pay their medical bills. Each story broke her heart and strengthened her resolve. She made mistakes. She approved a grant that turned out to be fraudulent and had to explain to Henry how she'd been deceived. She initially rejected an application that Miss Chen later proved was legitimate, nearly costing a family their home. Each time she stumbled, she expected to be fired. Each time, Henry was patient. "This is how you learn," he'd say. "I've made more mistakes than you can imagine. The key is learning from them." But the real storm came from an unexpected direction. 4 months into her new job, Sarah received a call from a journalist. The woman was writing a story about Henry's experiments in testing people's kindness, and she tracked down several people Henry had tested before Sarah. "Did he tell you about the others?" the journalist asked. "What others?" Sarah's voice was cold. "The waitress in Portland who failed his test by refusing to give him water. The shop owner in Denver who he exposed as a fraud. The teacher in Miami who he got fired after she was rude to him when he pretended to be a homeless person. Mr. Thornton has been playing God with people's lives for months, and you're just his latest project." Sarah felt sick. "I don't believe you. I have proof. Check your email. I'm sending you the documentation now." Sarah hung up and opened her email with shaking hands. The journalist had sent police reports, news articles, and sworn statements. The evidence was damning. Henry had tested people, and when they failed, he'd used his power and money to punish them, to ruin their reputations, to cost them their livelihoods. And Sarah had been his reward for passing his test. That night, Sarah sat in her new apartment, a beautiful 2-bedroom place. The Foundation's housing assistance program had helped her secure and felt like a fraud. All of this, everything she'd built, was based on an old man playing games with people's lives. Emma was asleep in her room, breathing easily for the first time in years thanks to the excellent health insurance. Sarah thought about the families she'd helped, the grants she'd approved, the lives that had changed because of the work she was doing. But could she continue working for a man who used his wealth to punish people for failing a test they didn't know they were taking? The next morning, Sarah walked into Henry's office without knocking. He looked up from his desk, surprised, then concerned at the expression on her face. "Sarah, what's wrong?" She threw the printed emails on his desk. "Tell me the truth. Did you ruin people's lives when they failed your test?" Henry's face went still. He looked at the papers, then back at her. "Who told you this? It doesn't matter. Is it true?" There was a long silence. Then Henry stood and walked to the window, his back to her. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with regret. "Some of it is true. Not all, but some." Sarah felt her heart crack. "How could you?" Henry turned to face her. "Because I was angry, Sarah. Angry at the world. Angry at God for taking Margaret. Angry at myself for not seeing what was right in front of me for so many years. After my wife died, I went looking for goodness and found so much cruelty instead. People who saw someone in need and laughed. People who kicked someone when they were down. And yes, I used my power to punish some of them." "That's not justice," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "That's revenge." "You're right," Henry said quietly. "It was revenge. And it was wrong." He sat down heavily in his chair. "The waitress in Portland, she didn't just refuse me water. She called security and had me thrown out into the rain because I looked homeless. I was angry, so I bought the restaurant chain and had her fired. The shop owner in Denver was selling fake medications to elderly people, and I exposed him, yes. The teacher in Miami told a student who reminded her of me that poor people were poor because they were lazy and stupid. I made sure the school board knew about her pattern of discrimination." Sarah sank into a chair processing this. "So you played judge and jury." "I did," Henry admitted. "And I was wrong. Not about their cruelty, that was real. But wrong to use my power that way. It took meeting you to remember what Margaret always tried to teach me. That kindness isn't about punishing the bad. It's about rewarding and encouraging the good." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Sarah, you passed a test you didn't know you were taking, yes. But I didn't hire you as a reward. I hired you because watching you with your daughter, seeing you sacrifice what little you had for a stranger, reminded me of who I wanted to be. You didn't just pass a test. You taught me something I'd forgotten." "What?" Sarah whispered. "That real kindness costs something. That it means giving when you have nothing left to give. That it's not about grand gestures but small daily choices to see people's humanity." He paused. "Sarah, these past months watching you run this foundation, I've seen you make the same choice over and over. To believe in people. To give them chances. To treat everyone with dignity. You haven't been working for me. You've been teaching me how to honor my wife's memory properly." Sarah felt tears running down her face. "The people you hurt, I've made amends where I could," Henry interrupted. "The waitress, I set up a scholarship fund in her name and apologized personally. She's in culinary school now, following her real dream. The shop owner deserved what he got, but I made sure he got treatment for the addiction that had driven him to crime. The teacher was offered counseling and the chance to change. Some accepted, some didn't, but I stopped playing God." He stood and walked around the desk, sitting in the chair beside Sarah. "I'm not a perfect man, Sarah. I'm not even a particularly good man. I'm just a very wealthy one trying to figure out how to leave the world better than I found it. And I can't do that without people like you people who are good. Not because it's easy, but because it's right." Sarah looked at him, this complicated, flawed, powerful man who tested her and been changed by her response. She thought about Emma, sleeping soundly for the first time in years. She thought about the families the foundation had helped. She thought about the choice in front of her. "If I stay," she said slowly, "things have to change." "Tell me how," Henry said simply. "No more tests, no more games. If you want to help people, we do it honestly and openly. We don't play with their lives or their dignity. We treat everyone with respect, regardless of how they treat us." Henry nodded. "Agreed. And I want you to set up a fund to help the people you hurt. Even the ones you think deserved it. Everyone deserves a second chance." "I'll do it," Henry said. "Anything else?" Sarah thought hard. "I want the foundation's mission expanded, not just to help people in crisis, but to create programs that prevent crisis. Job training, education, mental health support. I want to address the roots of poverty, not just the symptoms." A slow smile spread across Henry's weathered face. "Margaret would have loved you," he said softly. "She said the same things for years, and I was too focused on profit margins to listen." "Yes, Sarah. To all of it, yes." 2 years later, Sarah stood in the main hall of the Margaret Thornton Community Center, the foundation's newest project. The building had once been an abandoned warehouse. Now it housed job training programs, a medical clinic, a food bank, classrooms for adult education, and a child care center. It was Christmas Eve, and the center was hosting a dinner for families in need. The hall was decorated with lights and garland, tables laden with food, children running and playing while their parents shared meals and conversation. Emma, now 9 years old and healthy, was helping serve food alongside other volunteers. She'd grown confident in the past 2 years, no longer the quiet, worried child who'd watched her mother count pennies. She knew her mother's story, now knew about the morning in the diner, the test, the choice that had changed their lives. "Mama, Mr. Henry wants to talk to you," Emma called out. Sarah found Henry in a quiet corner, watching the scene with peaceful eyes. At 78, he'd slowed down, letting Sarah run the foundation while he served as an advisor and cheerleader. But he came to every event, shook every hand, learned every story. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said as Sarah joined him. "It is," she agreed. "We've served over 500 families this year. The job training program has a 90% placement rate. The clinic has treated over 1,000 patients. We're making a real difference, Henry." "No," he corrected gently. "You're making a real difference. I just write the checks." Sarah smiled. They'd had this argument before. "We're partners." "That we are." Henry pulled an envelope from his jacket. "I have something for you." Sarah opened it and gasped. Inside was a check for $1 million, made out to her personally. "Henry, I can't." "It's not from me," he interrupted. "It's from Margaret's life insurance policy. She left instructions that when I found someone who embodied her values of kindness and service, I was to give them this money to use as they saw fit. Sarah, you spent 2 years helping others. Use this for yourself. Pay off your debts. Buy a house. Send Emma to any college she wants. Build the security you've never had." Sarah's hands trembled. "This is too much." "It's not nearly enough," Henry said. "But it's a start. You gave me a $3 cup of coffee when you had $23 to your name. This is Margaret and me giving back." Across the room, Sarah saw a young mother she'd been working with, Jessica, who'd left an abusive relationship and was rebuilding her life. She was smiling at her 2 children, holding a plate of food, looking more peaceful than Sarah had ever seen her. "Do you remember what you told me once?" Sarah asked Henry. "About your wife making you promise to build a legacy of kindness?" "I do." "She'd be proud of you," Sarah said. "You kept your promise." Henry's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. "We kept it, you and me together. And Sarah, I need to tell you something." He led her to a chair and they sat together. "I'm sick. Cancer. The doctors give me maybe 6 months." Sarah's heart clenched. "Henry, it's all right," he said peacefully. "I've had a good life, a long life. And these past 2 years, watching you build this foundation into something real and lasting, have been the best years since Margaret died. I'm not afraid." "What can I do?" Sarah asked through tears. "Keep doing what you're doing. Keep being who you are. And when I'm gone, I want you to know that the foundation is yours. My will leaves it entirely in your hands, along with enough funding to keep it running for 50 years. The lawyers have all the details." Sarah couldn't speak. She just held the old man's hand, this complicated, wounded, generous soul who'd tested her kindness and been transformed by it. "Thank you," Henry whispered. "Thank you for reminding me that goodness exists, that small acts matter, that kindness is never wasted, even when it costs everything." "Thank you," Sarah replied, "for seeing something in me I didn't see in myself, for giving me the chance to turn pain into purpose." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the families around them. People who'd been helped, lives that had been changed, hope that had been restored. Emma ran over, breathless and happy. "Mama, can I tell Mr. Henry about my project?" "Of course, sweetheart." Emma launched into an enthusiastic explanation of her school project about community service. As Sarah listened to her daughter's confident, joyful voice, she thought about that cold November morning 2 years ago. She'd bought a stranger coffee. Such a small thing, $3.50 that she couldn't afford. A simple choice made without thinking, driven only by compassion and the memory of what it felt like to come up short. That choice had changed everything. But the real magic, Sarah had learned, wasn't in the reward that followed. It was in the act itself. Kindness was its own reward. Compassion was its own currency. And the simple choice to help another human being was never wasted, even when you couldn't see the results. Henry died 4 months later, peacefully in his sleep. At his funeral, Sarah delivered the eulogy, speaking about a man who'd spent his life building an empire and his last years building a legacy. She spoke about second chances and redemption. She spoke about the woman who taught him kindness and the promise he'd kept to her. And she spoke about a cup of coffee and how small acts of love could ripple out into the world in ways we could never imagine. The Margaret Thornton Foundation continues today, run by Sarah Mitchell and staffed by people who understand both struggle and service. They've helped thousands of families. They've created hundreds of jobs. They've given countless people a second chance at dignity and hope. And in the entrance hall of every foundation building, there's a simple plaque that reads, "Kindness is never wasted. It costs us something, and that's exactly what gives it value. Margaret Thornton." Below it is a photo, an elderly man in worn clothes sitting at a diner counter, and a young woman with kind eyes buying him coffee. A reminder that we never know when our small acts of kindness might change the world. This story carries a truth we all need to remember. Genuine kindness requires sacrifice, and that sacrifice is never wasted. Sarah didn't help Henry because she expected anything in return. She helped because she'd been desperate herself and knew what it felt like. She gave when she couldn't afford it, and that's exactly what made her gift meaningful. But the story also teaches us about redemption and change. Henry was a flawed man who used his power wrongly before learning to use it rightly. We all make mistakes. What matters is whether we're willing to learn, to change, to become better. The most powerful acts of kindness happen when we give not from our abundance, but from our need, when we choose compassion even when it costs us something. When we see another human being's dignity as more important than our own comfort. Sarah's $3 cup of coffee changed her life, yes, but more importantly, it changed Henry's heart. It reminded him of his wife's values. It redirected his wealth toward healing rather than revenge. It created a foundation that helped thousands. We never know the full impact of our kindness. That smile to a stranger, that dollar to someone in need, that moment of patience with someone who's struggling, these ripple out in ways we can't see. So the question isn't whether we can afford to be kind. The question is, can we afford not to be? If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe for more stories about faith, humanity, and the power of kindness. Leave a comment below about a time when someone's kindness changed your life, or when your kindness changed someone else's. Remember, your small act of love might be someone's turning point. Never underestimate the power of compassion. God bless you all.